Major funding for Florida Matters comes from the Mosaic Company, a leading producer of fertilizer made from phosphate, a natural resource found in Florida. America's farmers depend on Florida phosphate for their crop nutrition needs. Mosaic, helping America grow.
I'm standing today on Cuban soil, but I'm not in Cuba. Jose Marti Park, right here in Ybor City, is a bridge between two cultures. A piece of land owned by the Cuban government, but right in the middle of Tampa. Today we're going to explore the complex relationship between the US and Cuba and how Florida fits into it all. Hi, I'm Irene Mayer, and welcome to Florida Matters. This small piece of land in Tampa's Ybor City is owned by the Cuban government and was purchased in 1957 to honor the Cuban patriot Jose Marti. He's considered by many the apostle of Cuban independence. This place also serves as a symbol of the relationship between the state of Florida and the country of Cuba. Florida has a long history with Cuba. In the 1880s, Cuban citizens traveled freely to Tampa to work in the cigar factories of Ybor City and West Tampa. Many made Florida their home, but when Fidel Castro took control of Cuba in 1959, many Cubans fled to Miami as political refugees. In 1980, under tremendous pressure, Castro allowed 125,000 Cubans to leave for Miami in what is known as the Mariel boat lift. They came on any kind of boat that Miami organizers could secure. Again in 1994, amidst political turmoil, 50,000 Cubans left for Florida, this time risking their lives on homemade rafts. Today, 2 million Cubans reside in the United States, and 2/3 of them live in Florida. Because of the repressive Castro rule, the flow of Cuban refugees continues. The West Tampa Sandwich Shop is a place where friends can get together to talk about old and new times. The small restaurant sits in the heart of Tampa's Latin community, and many of the customers here have ties to Cuba. Melina Velasquez works as a waitress, serving café con leche, Cuban toast, and Tampa's famous Cuban sandwiches. Melina left Cuba in 1998 and still has close family there.
At that time, I didn't have anyone, and my family was there. Then I had the opportunity to bring my mother here with me after 10 years in this country. And now my mother's the only one here with me. The rest of my family is still in Cuba.
In reaction to 9/11, the Bush administration tightened restrictions on Cuba, limiting Melina's ability to visit her family and send them financial support.
Of course, I would really like for the restrictions to be taken away, because even though my mother is here, and my father and his brother and his wife will be coming soon, my grandparents, my uncles, my cousins, all my family's still there, and I still have to help them because the economic situation in Cuba is very bad. And of course, I would love to have all the restrictions taken away so that I could go to see all my family that's still there, send them money, call them, and visit whenever I want. For me, that would be a lot better.
A week after taping this interview, President Barack Obama signed a bill easing those restrictions. For Melina and many Cuban-Americans, this will provide a lifeline to their family members. Patrick Montega, editor of La Gaceta, a popular Spanish-language newspaper, is frustrated with the lack of forward progression.
We actually probably gone backwards in our relationship with Cuba from where it was 7 or 8 years ago.
At the West Tampa Sandwich Shop, there's no shortage of opinion on Cuba and the embargo. Many patrons would like to see the embargo lifted for a variety of reasons. Rex Rodriguez travels to Cuba regularly on business.
What I'd like to see is the embargo lifted and all the travel ban lifted, for the simple reason is It's been used for 40-some years as the cause of all the problems in Cuba.
I think that if the embargo don't do nothing for how long, 40 or 50 years, I don't think that is good at all.
The United States embargo against Cuba has been in place since February 7, 1962. Its purpose was and still is to bring down the Castro regime by blocking trade with the small island nation. Since the beginning, some of the embargo's most passionate supporters have been Floridians. But as time marches on, some hardliners are considering a new approach. Here's Carson Cooper with the story.
With a focus on ousting Fidel Castro, Miami's Cuban exiles became major players in Florida and U.S. politics. Ronald Reagan was among the first presidential candidates to recognize their influence. Since then, presidential hopefuls have made it a point to address their concerns. One of the purposes of the embargo, signed by President Kennedy, was to punish Castro for siding with the Soviet Union. Now the Cold War is over, the Castro regime is still in place, and the U.S. embargo against Cuba is 47 years old. From the beginning, it has been these original exiles who have led the fight to keep the embargo intact. The fact that they represent a large voting bloc in an important swing state ensures that they are not ignored. Tampa attorney Ralph Fernandez is one of those Cuban exiles. He has always been a proponent of the embargo until now.
In a perfect world, I would have wanted the Cubans and the Cuban-Americans to have gotten together and gotten rid of Fidel long ago. But that's not how it happened. Castro won. We're 50 years into it. We've got a lot of problems. So what do? We support contact. We support engagement.
Andrew Solero is also a post-revolution exile. He has a successful furniture business in Ybor City.
I hear rumors and things like that they want to make some kind of relation between the two countries. And, you know, at the beginning I'll probably be opposed to it, but the more I think about it, I may have an open mind and listen to see what they plan to do.
What is the objective? The objective is a transition in Cuba. Are we going to get a transition to democracy in Cuba? No.
We got to try some other things. We got to try different ideas. And if we take the embargo down and it works and it's good for our country, maybe it liberates our country. Maybe it helps our revolution within Cuba for people to say, hey, this is good. American is good. And Castro doesn't have the chance of Raul Castro to blame the United States anymore for their mistakes and for they don't have anything to eat. Now he's going to have to go and face reality. It's not the embargo. It's the government in Havana. It's the Cuban government who's holding the people down.
Ralph Fernandez says his stance has changed because the situation has changed.
Fidel Castro's gone. He was a stumbling block. The reason I say that is while he was there, you cannot reward someone like him by engaging him. It affects the core of our values. If we reward a murderer, a dictator, a tyrant, and an exporter of all of that by engaging him. But he's out of the way.
A lot of the old people like me that comes from the 60s, we think that way. Maybe we are getting soft a little bit. And in Miami today, I think if we really try to find out, it would be a 50-50.
Changing the embargo would be sad for maybe 10 or 15% of the Cuban Americans who still hold hope that through some tough stance, a miracle will happen and we'll be able to go back to Cuba.
According to Patrick Mantega, Florida may have an uphill battle for business if the embargo is ever lifted.
Because Florida really is the home base for the population that has kept this relationship between Cuba and the U.S. chilled. Florida has probably the worst relation of any state with Cuba.
But Fernandez says the U.S. has bigger reasons to change its relationship with Cuba.
What is the problem? The problem is a long-term event going on in Cuba right now.
In our absence, China's come in and invested tremendous amounts of money.
China is making a concerted effort to take over Cuba. If we don't do something radical in Cuba, which may not be a perfect scenario, which may not be a change to democracy as we wish it, but as long as we keep China out and we keep some level of control and contact with Cuba, we'll avoid a great, big problem 2 decades from now.
President Barack Obama says he is willing to engage the aging revolutionary Raul Castro to see if positive advances can be made. And Cuban Americans, even the old guard, are watching and hoping for the best.
Now we got to see what's going to happen with this new administration. You know, a lot of people is expecting a lot of things. A lot of people is going to expect miracles to happen. That's not going to happen. I'm going to give Obama the benefit of the doubt. And I want to wait to see 6 months to a year what kind of situation we're going to be in. Not only in my country, in this country. Yes, I'm going to give it the benefit of the doubt. I got to go ahead and respect him as my president, give him a chance to prove what he can do, and if he doesn't, then in 4 years, we're going to have to talk.
For Florida Matters, I'm Carson Cooper.
At one time, a Cuban citizen could board a steamship, travel to Tampa, and work in one of Ybor City's cigar factories. But by the time of the Cuban Revolution, freedoms like that had vanished. Roberto Kairos was born and raised in Havana, but by the time he was 24, he was desperate to reach Florida. Roberto Kairos is a Cuban-American. He lives in West Tampa with his wife and 2 daughters and works here at the El Pino tire shop. He's living the American dream, but to get here, he had to endure a nightmare. In 1994, Cuba erupted in political turmoil. 50,000 Cubans took advantage of the distraction, built rafts of inner tubes and canvas, and set out on a 90-mile journey toward freedom. Roberto's story is their story.
Originally from Havana, Cuba, and I came over on a raft.
We asked him if he was ever afraid.
Afraid? A couple of times, but you know, once you make that choice, once you make that decision, it's no turning back.
There were 11 people on Roberto's raft. They lost their food supply on the first night. On the 3rd day, they ran into another raft with 10 people who had been in the water for days. They tied their rafts together.
The morning of the 4th day, we picked a girl up, a beautiful girl. I've been in the water for 3 days, floating by itself on a raft. And she has seen her husband, her brother-in-law, and the brother-in-law's wife sunk. And she was devastated. I mean, you couldn't even ask her a question because she wouldn't even know what to say.
On the 5th day, they were rescued, picked up by the US Coast Guard, and sent to Guantanamo. We asked Roberto why he would risk his life to come here.
This is the greatest country in the world. No wonder everybody wants to come out here. It gives you an opportunity to be your own. It gives an individual, as an individual, an opportunity to succeed.
Roberto invited us to his home in West Tampa. It is important for him to tell his story.
The wind started picking up really hard, so we had only 1 oar. And the guys, we started talking, let's make a sail with the canvas, wherever the wind blows. I said, let's go. So I grabbed the oar and put it in between my legs here and held it, right? And we put the canvas on top, and 2 other guys were holding the canvas as a sail. And started picking up. You can see the raft barely hitting. Now, at this point, it's really windy, but the wave was not that high. You ask me why. So, and the raft is moving. Where we were going, I have no idea. I remember I was trembling. It was so cold. I was trembling, and a friend of mine just grabbed me from the bag and held me. So, oh man, because I was wet from holding everybody was in the back of the raft, and the waves, I hated me, so I was all wet, and I was shaking. So this buddy of mine just grabbed me from the bag and said, oh, man, I'm a little bit drier than you. I mean, I'm trying to keep you warm. I'll never forget that.
Roberto's brother came by raft as well at the same time, but Roberto didn't know it until they met up in Guantanamo.
He was not supposed to go.
No.
He didn't want to come.
I never want to come.
He went to the beach to see if he would find me or help somebody bring a raft over there, and they helped the guys, him and a friend of his, help the guy put the raft and they leave. And there's two other guys struggling and say, oh man, we need 2 more guys to help me out. And
I said, you don't need 2 more, you need just 1, me, that's it.
Roberto and his brother remember how bad it was in Cuba.
If you walk from your girlfriend's house to the bus stop to take a bus to go home, they will stop you 2-3 times. 3 blocks away. Where are you coming from?
Economic conditions were deplorable.
How you legally feed your family? How can you feed your family by just going to the store and buying if there's nothing in the store?
No way to do it.
Or you already bought whatever it is that they allocate for you at the store.
That night, Roberto and his family enjoyed a meal they could have never had in Cuba. They enjoyed the taste of freedom. Of the 50,000 who left Cuba when Roberto left, only 30,000 have been accounted for. Roberto normally works in construction, but because of the tough economy, he enjoys his work at the El Pino tire shop. He plays soccer on Sundays in the warm Florida sun and continues to live out his American dream. In today's Florida Story, Larry Elliston visits with another Cuban-American family as the memories of Castro fade with time, distance, and new generations.
East of Tampa, 2 kids at play in a Florida suburb. 8-year-old Samantha Garritex and her brother, 6-year-old Andrew. Maybe the only conflict they know in their young lives: who can keep the ball longer.
Pass the ball back.
Samantha and Andrew are a generation far removed from a world in which their own parents grew up. Ernie and Yvette were college sweethearts. Born in Miami, both are first-generation Cuban-Americans whose own childhoods centered on parents who fled their island homeland and the reign of Fidel Castro. Tonight, Ernie's sister, Marilyn Garritex, has stopped by for dinner.
He couldn't get the bag open.
Dinner conversation was mostly about school.
He's tiny.
Unlike the days when Ernie and Marilyn and Yvette were kids, there was no talk around the table of Cuba. But Aunt Marilyn doesn't want her niece and nephew to forget the hardships once faced by their grandparents or the pursuit in America of their hopes and dreams. So as a journalist for the St. Petersburg Times, Marilyn wrote about her own experience growing up with Fidel Castro. Her personal essay was written a year ago. It still rings true.
50 Years of Fidel in My Family by Marilyn Garritex. Back in Cuba, the sky was brighter. Back in Cuba, the grass was greener. Back in Cuba, the flowers were prettier. My siblings and I grew up hearing that phrase constantly. There was one and only one thing that wasn't great back in Cuba: Fidel Castro. I have never met the man, but he has been a never-ending presence in my life. My parents, grandparents, and other adults in my family despise him. They had to adapt to a new country while mourning the loss of their homeland, to a revolution they vehemently opposed, and they blamed Fidel for everything. When I was a child, he was the boogeyman. When I was a teenager, he was the reason I didn't know my uncles, aunts, cousins in Cuba. When I was a college student, he became the center of political discussions with my father. And when I became a journalist, he was the focus of bad newspaper stories written by people who didn't understand Fidel and what he had done. At least that's what my father said. I'd explain that the stories were striving to present the facts and allow people to judge for themselves. Papi was never swayed. He had one response: he's Fidel.
Marilyn's father, Erasmo, was born in the countryside of Camagüey province, and her mother, Sylvia, in Havana. Though engaged in their beloved Cuba, the young couple would marry in Miami.
Fidel's 1959 revolution divided my father and his 11 siblings, pitting brother against brother. My father acknowledges that the army wasn't perfect, but to him, Fidel's politics were far worse. His father, a country judge, died in jail. My father has hinted at being jailed himself, but won't say more than that. He eventually escaped and was the first to arrive in Miami in April 1960. My mom, who worked for an American cargo company, smuggled him aboard a departing ship to Key West. She followed a few months later, arriving on the American company's last ship out of Cuba. US-Cuban relations chilled to a deep freeze shortly after. My parents were married in November 1960 with only 2 family friends as witnesses. Many and their families eventually arrived on the Freedom flights that brought thousands to the United States. My father's older brothers and younger sister, however, remained in Cuba. It is hard for me to imagine the courage it took to leave home for a strange land. As a journalist, I was in a Coast Guard cutter reporting on the 1994 exodus Fidel allowed that had Cubans jumping on rafts. Whether in the end they did it for political reasons or economic reasons, every time a Cuban was pulled from the sea, I thanked my parents. Moments like that and my father's stories helped me understand that their obsession with Fidel stems from an emotional and personal place. My parents would like us to despise Fidel with the same passion. Perhaps some in my generation do, but my brother, sister, and I will never experience what our parents did. We can only respect it, try to put ourselves in their shoes, and support it in our own way. Everything is Fidel's fault.
But as little Andrew made the weekly phone call to his grandparents, still living in Miami after 50 years,
Hello.
how are you? It was quickly apparent that conversation between the 3 Garritex generations was not about the past. Like their father and Aunt Marilyn before them, Andrew and Samantha are being introduced to Cuban culture, but it's different.
My niece and nephew, however, don't know who Fidel is. My father rarely talks about him in their presence. As with us, he is reluctant to share the painful memories. Papi, ¿cómo estás? My generation is Cuban-American, but my niece and nephew are perhaps more American-Cuban.
Hi, abuelo.
How are you?
Good.
¿Está bien?
Sí.
Muy bien, gracias. ¿Cómo está? Bien, bien.
Though Marilyn and Ernie didn't experience the pains of Cuba firsthand, they lived it through parents who did.
And though we want to keep that, living memory for them, it's also tough as, especially with my children in the next generation, how it becomes further apart, and they don't really understand, Fidel and what Fidel did to the country.
So we're sort of caught between sort of the past and the future. The future is, generations who will probably know less about Fidel and less about what's happened in Cuba, but the past remains strong, and those of us who are in between and are really the link in between those 2 generations.
But they do see the benefits, and they do see, the best parts of Cuba, and, the livelihood as far as all the work ethic that my parents has brought over and done, and the good parts about our traditions and family and the food and all the good times.
An ailing Fidel Castro retired as president in February 2008, only to be succeeded by his brother Raul. But the legacy of Fidel still looms. Marilyn Garritex envisions a time when the bearded Cuban dictator will no longer be a part of family conversations, but she's certain Fidel Castro will always be a presence in her life. You see, Marilyn and Fidel both share the same birthday, August 13th.
Thank you for joining us for Florida Matters. To comment or join our discussion on Cuba, go to WUSF.org/Florida Matters. Until next time, I'm Irene Mayer.
Major funding for Florida Matters comes from the Mosaic Company, a leading producer of fertilizer made from phosphate, a natural resource found in Florida. America's farmers depend on Florida phosphate for their crop nutrition needs. Mosaic, helping America grow.